than I am. This is good. But these are good questions. We're going to go back right now to Christ Chapel, where they are getting started with our with our panel discussion following these last two talks.
One of the sessions that I was most interested in hearing, because with the scientists, I know they're all great speakers, and I know their work, or I'm familiar with their work. But with essentially the humanities session, I was interested in hearing that perspective, and I will say that Benjamin and Tricia did not disappoint at all, at all.
One of the things that I saw as a similarity between what several of the scientists said, in some way, prioritize sleep. Right, the most important thing we can take away is make sleep a priority. And I couldn't help thinking as I listened to both of this afternoon's talks about the ways in which there might be other allied systems in the fight. So I hadn't thought of it when Tricia was in my class yesterday, but about the possibility that much of the same language you're using is part of what the environmental movement is telling us. It's part of what a lot of therapeutic movements, I think you mentioned that, are saying. And this whole idea of, are there multiple different ways in which there are other allied systems that could be working in this? And one of the questions that came through the chat was asking another question about AI. In other words, I think, Benjamin, your section about kind of how, more in your book than in your talk, but about how industrialization is pushing us towards this productivity culture. Is that a way to reduce the work week? Are there ways in which we can collectively reclaim issues? Consume less, produce less. So I don't know if anyone can have a reaction to that, but
well, I don't have a simple answer to that, but I think one of the things that we can learn from the humanities is that there are multiple contexts for every phenomenon, and that's sort of what we specialize in doing, is looking at either a text or an experience and saying, what shapes it, and it's never one thing. And I learned something about this. I mean, it. They don't really teach you in grad school that that's what you're doing. But I learned from teaching with a scientist on the first time I taught this course on literature and science of sleep, and he talked about the ways in which, in his studies, he really tried to isolate out all the variable factors so that he could understand the mechanism. But in the humanities, we don't isolate out the factors, the context. That's what we're interested in. That's where the meaning resides, is an experience in its context. And so, broad kind of forces like the economy, like historical ideology and cultural belief systems shape everything that we do. And finding the ways, finding the joints is part of the job of the humanities. So that's a very broad way of, responding to a kind of specific question. I don't know if you have thoughts about it.
Was the question AI, about AI?
I mean, that and also other systems that might be helping us in this struggle.
Totally.
And, things like unions came up also in the live stream, or things like reducing the work week, or capturing finding an ally in the environmental movement.
Yes. Yeah, when I first started the work, I was getting a lot of people from the 4-day work week were reaching out to me, overseas. They don't have it here, but it was a movement happening around getting the 4-day work week and thinking about labor laws. And I'm a big union supporter, because I was raised by a union organizer. And so I look at those things and think about the idea of work and labor, and also I think the education systems, because I talk about in my book how I believe that this idea of ignoring your body's cues for rest, ignoring your body, becoming disembodied and disconnecting begins to be trained, and you learn that really early in schools. When I was teaching and working in schools, a big example would be working in the second grade classroom. Bathroom times at a certain time, but if a child has to go to the bathroom, they have to wait. And I watch the child use the restroom on themselves. And this idea of beginning to teach people to ignore their body, ignore the cues, just become disembodied, disconnected, begins really early, when you're really young in public schools. If there's some teachers here, they know, maybe they have taught a long time, they understand, like taking away recess and playtime, taking away music and all those things in schools, just get to this like cookie cutter idea of how to educate a person, making children sit, for 8 hours, and when they don't sit, they're labeled as disruptive, or they have behavioral problems. So all these things that kind of begin from a very young age for people to begin to start to disconnect with their body, to be disembodied, to not listen to the cues when your body is like, I'm tired, but instead we just ignore, we're taught to ignore that. And so I'm really interested in those things and think that working in schools, education, working with unions, really deepening into the idea of like fair labor practices is really, I think those are two of the main ones that really I'm curious and really have light about. I'm really interested in.
Labor unions have really been one of the most powerful forces arguing for sleep health, right? The slogan, the galvanizing slogan of the labor movement in the early 20th century was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will.
Yeah.
And the story I always like to tell is about the Pullman porters, Pullman sleeping cars. Big industries, long-range train travel became more prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th century. Most of the porters who had to sleep in these terrible conditions on trains, they would travel sometimes 36 hours, and they would have just a tiny little cot without any guardrails, and maybe an hour or two to sleep here and there. And these were often, the descendants of enslaved people. It was almost entirely black workforce. But they got busy and they unionized, and they formed a union that testified before Congress about the health effects and also the labor effects of these wretched sleep conditions.
Yeah.
And they made some change.
Definitely. Want to shout out Chicago South Side. They were Pullman, Chicago Union Strong. So I love the story of the Pullman. There's some really beautiful archival photos of them that I was able to uncover when I was doing research. When I first started to do research, I was really looking for photos of black people resting, and it was really difficult to find any photos of black people resting. I think all the ones that are out there I have found, and they're out somewhere. I put them up in a lot of installations, but I went deep into the archives as an archivist to really begin this work. This work really did start with my work in archives. It started with me being exhausted, and then studying cultural trauma in schools, and then working in archives, and then it just became this mix that came together. So I really think this is an historical examination of what has happened and what labor and resting has meant to bodies. And so there's some really beautiful photos of Pullman porters, that black and white, showing them on trains, showing their sleeping conditions and the whole history of them, right from the south side of Chicago.
Here's a beautiful question that might reframe this in a way for the scientists also. What is made visible and what is obscured if you call sleep a resource? If you think about sleep differently?
That's a question.
Well, I can talk about, there's a really interesting book by, he's an art historian, but he's really kind of a cultural theorist named Jonathan Crary. He wrote a book called 24/7, and it's about the ways in which our particular version of a high-tech, highly connected, global capitalistic system that is feeds on information technology is promoting a nonstop culture of buying and selling, and there's an attention economy that's always on, always pulling it into it, and it completely disrupts sleep. But he says, sleep is a natural resource that is very hard for big corporations to commodify in the way that they've commodified oil and clean air, and this stuff is just flowing on all around us. Here it is, in a bottle form. Sleep is hard to commodify that way, but they're chipping away at it. So that's one way of thinking about it. That it is a sort of a renewable energy source if we can just tap into it.
I think one of the things that question is getting at, though, if I can just push it a little bit harder, is we don't use the language of resource when we're not within a capitalist economy.
Maybe.
So I'm wondering, I think I heard a little bit of a disparity between the way you, Benjamin, used the word resource, and Tricia, I don't think you do use the word resource to describe sleep.
No, I can understand it though. Yeah, I definitely, as he's speaking about, I get that, but I think my concept comes out of more of a spiritual lens, a wholeness lens, a lens of, I didn't get into it, but Afrofuturism and imagination, understanding that I believe rest to be a portal, a literal portal that you can go into, like things happen there that can't happen when you're awake, that you can work things out, that it becomes a deep, deep gift and a blessing for us to be able to find quality sleep. And so I think my work as an artist and as a theologian and then being an activist, I see sleep as a deep, I really call it a portal. It's another place to go. It's a place to go to be safe. It's a place to go to renew yourself. And so whenever I'm speaking to people and they're like, you kind of going too far with that. Like, I'm like, okay, well, I'll come back and I'll bring the science. And I'm like, well, actually, if you can't drop in that way, you can drop into the idea like you literally are really putting damage on your body by not sleep. And I'll bring in the science of sleep and the ideas around like all of the researchers. I don't know as much as them, but I do love neuroscience and I love sleep. And when I first started the work, I read a book that I love called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, I believe.
Postdoc of
Yes.
Bob Stickles.
I love that book. That book was really one of the beginning books of me really developing and kind of playing around with the ideas. I really wanted to settle in that idea of what was really happening, the way he speaks about dreams, the way he speaks about what happens when you don't sleep, really stayed with me.
I think resource covers a lot of things, but maybe what it obscures is that it's a resource, an essential resource, but it's also a state of being.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well put.
Yeah, resource would imply something outside of us.
Yeah. That's good.
That's interesting.
Okay. I'm brought back to some of my radical youth by your talk, so thank you. And if I can go to the terminology from the 60s.
Yeah.
Do we have to smash capitalism if we really, really want to achieve the goals you're after, or are we just chipping away without it?
I don't think so. I don't think capitalism will ever fall in my lifetime, so I'm not waiting on it. I come from that idea. I'm not waiting on it. I'm really saying that the time is now to have quality sleep. The time is now to encourage justice movements, and so I'm not waiting on it to ever fall. But I actually love that I'm able to make the connections between it, because when I first started the work in 2013, and I would tell this to someone, it was like, nothing you're saying is making sense. What does capitalism have to do with me not resting? I like to grind. I like working a lot. I got to make money. I love it.
That's exactly what capitalism has to do with.
Yes, that's exactly. So it was like, that was the education piece, is that I was like bringing people and they were like, they would cock their head. Like, I get it now. I never saw it. And so that's what I hope my work to be, is that it is just a light. It removes a veil from an eye. It helps people to begin to tap in and see the connections that are happening around them, because I believe in the divinity of humans and in the power of a human being when they are illuminated with an idea and with something that really affects them. They can make a way. They can work around it. I go back to my ancestors, thinking about, my grandmother and my great-grandmother being a descendant of enslaved people and what they did. I'm reading about Harriet Tubman right now. The new book I'm writing is about, that's coming out next month, is about the idea of escape, the idea of fugitivity and maroonage, and what we have to do to escape the systems. We don't wait. It can stay. You can do what you want to do, but we're going to still build and craft a radical way with each other. I'm really deep on the idea of deep community care, subversion, flexibility, and imagination. So, yeah.
Can't wait to read that. And I'm also working on a little something on Harriet Tubman as well,
nice.
involving dreaming. And
I love
so
it.
we got more to talk about. But
Yeah,
in terms of ending capitalism, since you there's a famous literary theorist, Marxist literary theorist named Frederick Jameson, who passed away a few days ago. And he
really?
invented the term late capitalism to describe our moment. And when I first heard of that, I thought, oh, how does he know it's late? How does he know it's not we're not early? But I do think rather than is it going to end? Is it going to be? Is there something else?
Right.
What is it? At least describe it. Like what it is and what effects it's having on us and on our social relationships, on our daily rhythms, and on our beliefs. And I think a lot of us go through our lives, and we're sort of not aware of how big economic forces are kind of constraining us in a way. And so description first.
Yeah.
And sleep too, right?
And maybe this goes back to the 60s too, but yesterday in the class visit, they mentioned the idea that there are personal things you can do too. You don't have to wait to grapple with big systems. If you think it's unjust for a worker at 7-Eleven to have to be there at 3 in the morning, don't patronize that place at 3 in the morning. And gradually that will work itself out within capitalism. The idea that there are things you can do to remove yourself, I thought was interesting from our class visit yesterday.
I like those classes.
I've got another one that's for anyone. Are there societies and cultures that we wish to model? And historically, or I would say presently, what cultures and societies are the most well-rested? They always do the happiness index, and I think Finland is always way up there. But are there other
Probably
places?
sleep well.
Yeah, they probably do sleep well. Are there other places whose practices we should be actively adopting?
There was, I think it was in Danish, there was a 3-part way of life they had. And I'm going to mispronounce it. It was like rust, regularment, and something else. Rest, regularity, and health. And so when the parents in there, if there was a play or something in the evening, guess what? School would start later for the children the next day. So it was sort of all put together. I mean, this may be mythology, but it was a sleep guy who had gone there with his family for a sabbatical, and he said, wow, this really felt different in important ways. So, and I think they're still getting more sleep than the rest of Europe and certainly North America. So it's a cultural thing for them.
So I wrote a little piece about a town in Germany called Bad Kissingen, which is a health resort town. It had a health spa going back for centuries, and they decided that they were going to run a chronobiological experiment on the entire town. And they got a big grant and a small enough town that they could do this. And they tried to adjust all the work schedules and the school schedules to optimal circadian conditions in the hospitals as well. So monitoring the lighting and the external lighting, the street lights would sort of, dim or use a much less harsh light at a certain hour, and experimenting with, trying to get patients access to natural daylight, and I found that really fascinating. The problem, though, is that when you have a lot of sort of experts trying to run and design a city and then telling people you have to show up at this time and do it this way, it creates friction. And it's not exactly a sort of naturally occurring. And so I don't know if people's sleep patterns fell in line with the way that they were supposed to. But,
They tried.
Yeah, there are people who are trying.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up something related to the cultural difference, and that is, this issue of privacy that you brought up. So to what extent is privacy important for sleep? And because I always think of privacy as being a mixed blessing, right? I mean, there are good things about it, but there's a fine line between privacy and loneliness.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's culturally variable. In some societies, sleeping in public is not such a big deal, and for us, it's kind of shameful, and especially when it's the wrong kind of person who's in public. If it looks like somebody who's, unhoused. There was a famous, episode at Yale University where there was a black student who fell asleep in a lounge, and somebody called the cops on her, and You know, so we have this kind of taboo against public sleeping, which is especially harshly enforced for some people who look like they, you know, they don't fit or there's something suspicious about it. But in some other cultures, it's, you know, it's kind of common for people to, in Japan, for instance, to...
But also multiple people sharing a room.
Yeah, multiple people sharing a room. And I think that is more the norm of human history
Right.
than our very peculiar way.
But also, when I was an undergraduate, I did tutoring in projects in Roxbury in Boston. And I was stunned that when I visited the apartment of the young girl who I was tutoring, she had a bedroom. The next room over was the living room with the TV. There was no door. There was a curtain. And outside her window, it went down to a concrete yard where the kids, the teenagers, would be playing and shouting until 1 or 2 in the morning, she said. So there's a kind of privacy is not my suburban privacy where I don't want to be on the same hall as my parents. Right? It's just being able to have sound privacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, certain kinds of, you know, reductions of noise and light are important for achieving and maintaining sleep. But, you know, I gave a talk a few years ago about childhood sleeping and the rise of the ideology of, you know, the private bedroom for children. And a guy came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I immigrated to this country when I was very young. My family came, I think it was from the Philippines. And we all, you know, all the kids slept in one room. And when I went to school, and I had a friend come over, he looked at that and was like, "Where's your bedroom?" And I felt ashamed, you know. I felt ashamed, and then I wouldn't have friends come over to the house anymore. So, you know, that gives you a sense that we have this particular way of doing things that isn't really all that widely shared, but we treat it as kind of natural and normal. There's since the late 19th century, all the pediatric and psychological advice about childhood sleeping involves getting them, at least in the U.S. and in much of Europe, involves like
Getting them out.
separate space.
Get
Get
them
out of here.
immediately out. Yeah, like they're 2 days old. Get them out of your room. It's like 2 days.
Exactly.
Well, out of the parents' room, but also, you know, you have to have your own. I never had my own room growing up.
Right.
Never.
Yeah.
Always shared with my sisters.
Yeah.
Yep.
And my father says, you know, that his 2 brothers and he shared a bed.
Yeah.
My 2 brothers and I shared a bedroom.
Was your
and
father an
he's-
immigrant?
What?
Was your father an immigrant?
His parents were.
His parents were, okay, yeah.
And he says he figures that my kids will be lucky if they share the same house.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I was going to say, thinking about what you were saying yesterday, Mariska, about the collaborations with HUD, thinking about capitalism, houses need to be bigger and bigger and bigger, which is another manifestation of capitalism, right? Like my house at 900 square feet is infinitesimal, right? And if everyone needs their own room, suddenly we have we need a bigger salary, right? So there's ways in which these things escalate. I'm thinking about a very interesting conversation I had in my class. We were discussing Benjamin's book, and a student from India talked about finding our conversation about single bedrooms very odd, and he said, in my family, depending on which house we were living in, different groups of us lived or slept in
Right.
different rooms together, and there was no sense of like my room. In fact, he said my room was used for other activities
Right.
altogether.
Yeah.
It wasn't a sleeping place at all.
So I guess from a historical perspective, I'm going to ask, I guess, Benjamin, because I don't know and I'm quite curious, and I don't know if you know the answer, but could certainly probably enlighten us with your thoughts. This idea of the privacy and not having a shared space, it seems to be relatively new, maybe? Because when I think about the culture that I'm from, and when Tricia said she was from the south side of Chicago, I was like, oh, her people are from Mississippi.
Yep, they are. They call it Little Mississippi.
Yes, I knew exactly. But, you know, growing up, it was you shared space.
Yeah, everybody.
You did. When you had a child, that child slept in the bed with you, and then transition to sleeping with siblings
Yeah.
if they had them, or cousins. And when we would go to grandparents' house, you would have all the cousins
Yes.
with pallets and pillows in any space that they can lie
Everywhere,
on.
yeah.
Right? And that was common.
I will tell you, Mariska, that when I talked with students about this in my class, and I asked them, how many of you had your own bedroom by age 6? And I would say about 3/4 of the hands went up. And I said, how many of you had it by age 10? And, a couple more hands went up. All those whose hands didn't go up were either African American or were from another country.
Yep, makes sense.
And I'm not saying there were no people in that group who didn't have their bedroom, but when I talk about this as a sort of Eurocentric ideal, that's what it means.
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's
Well, one of the other questions, this is a variation of something that's been asked in a couple of sessions. So there were a number of clear disparities indicated between men and women in terms of sleep. And I know in another context we talked about young mothers as the new shift workers, right? They're carrying a lot of burden. Would anyone care to elaborate on other ways in which sleep differs for men and women?
So as far as disorders, we can start with there versus sleep health. Women are about 3 times more likely to experience insomnia. Yes.
Wow.
And as far as sleep apnea, for a long time, the epidemiology pointed to it being more prevalent in men. And that still holds in some cases, but yesterday as I was speaking about pregnancy, it seems that even something that's considered mild in a non-pregnant person can be severe in a pregnant person. And as a woman reaches menopause or transitions into menopause, then that prevalence of apnea seems to be on par with men. So it's something about estrogen or those hormones that is protective in a phase. It's interesting when we talk about, you have, of course, the sex differences or the gender differences, but, we also talked about the differences or alluded to the differences across race and ethnicity. And you see stark differences, whether it's African American who experience the worst sleep, but some of those differences do level out a little bit, and this is work with by Dana Johnson and Chandra Jackson, where if you would hear them speak or look at their work, they would talk about its place and not race, or it's your zip code and not your genetic code when you start talking about those differences. But something that's quite interesting when we're talking about sex or gender differences and disparities in sleep health with women, Black women, regardless of socioeconomic status, experience the worst sleep.
Yep.
Do you take anything from the study about hypervigilance as a sort of...
So
Yeah.
this is one of the things that we're always saying, well, we don't necessarily know what the mechanism is, but the thought is that it may be this hypervigilance. So say you come from a neighborhood where maybe it is of lower economic status, but it's your community, you feel protected in that community, even if the community may be violent or it may not be violent, right? Because every community, just because it's poor, doesn't mean that it's violent, right? And I think sometimes people confound those things. But if you, and I'll just use this as an example, say you are a person who comes from maybe a community that doesn't have a lot of resources, but you go up and in socioeconomic status, and you are surrounded by the best security, you have the best things money could buy, but your sleep is still horrible because you're listening for that knock, or you're walking through that neighborhood and you're wondering if people are looking and that you don't belong, right? Or you go to your neighborhood store and you think that the cashier may be looking at you a little bit you know, like you're going to take something, right? And so you're always vigilant or always changing and shifting. Tanae Lewis, who's also at Emory, I don't know if you know her work. She's actually funded currently for a grant where she's looking, she calls it shifting in Black women. We call it a different word sometimes, code switching.
Yeah.
But she's looking at how switching in different environments impacts the sleep of Black women.
Yeah, that's good.
Amazing.
Marisha, is there any evidence of differences in basic sleep need based by race, ethnicity, or gender?
So the research hasn't shown any. It hasn't. It hasn't shown any differences in basic needs.
Yeah.
Just wanted to add too on the subject of the sex differences. Even, you know, aside even from sleep apnea and insomnia, women have huge changes in their sleep cycles during menopause, pregnancy, puberty. I mean, yeah, there's that as well.
And as children, boys and girls seem to be relatively similar in their sleep, but once you hit puberty, it changes drastically.
Well, this is a disciplinary question, so this is my indulgence here. So teaching in the Department of Communication Studies, we've talked a little bit about the need for better public health communication campaigns, maybe for thinking about social media. We on this campus as a liberal arts college offer the only data visualization course I'm familiar with at the undergraduate level, and we do courses in our department on civic deliberation and dialogue, and we offer a course on scientific rhetoric. Is there something that our field, communication studies or public communication, public health communication, should be doing better or doing more of? Are there courses that are missing? And I was thinking of Dr. Nedergaard's slides and kind of saying, well, she would have probably succeeded if she had a film, but you know, she didn't have a film, so maybe that's why that research got ignored. And as we think about the challenge of moving the work that you all do into the public realm in a better or faster way, so that's part one, is there something we should be doing differently? And how many of your own labs or graduate schools or programs have specific dedicated units that teach how to translate scientific rhetoric into public dialogue, or whatever that means in your field?
That's a good question.
I don't think we do.
I mean, we have it a little bit on the edges. We have, it's in my department, some people who teach technical writing and writing in the life sciences and that kind of thing. But I would say, Phil, you know, maybe one other thing to think about it from the discipline of communications would be not solely about how can we serve, you know, the scientists in getting the message out, but how might discourse analysis, you know, and media analysis also contribute to our understandings of health, you know, because health is also responds to ideology and communication and media as well. So
At MIT, my daughter teaches in the writing program at MIT. MIT brilliantly, or obviously, realized that scientists who do great work and can't communicate it aren't all that useful.
Yeah.
And so all undergraduates at MIT have to take 2 writing-intensive courses where they're basically learning how to communicate with regular people about complex scientific concepts and results. And I think that's what we need more of. And I feel that that's also only half the problem, right? Because that gets the science out there, and it doesn't teach those students to address also the cultural issues, the socioeconomic, the racist issues in that presentation, and how you can do that.
So I usually don't put a plug in for things, and the only reason for this is because I work for the government. I do not, plug anything, but because I came in through this type of program, I can talk about my own personal experience. So certain societies, and this particularly AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that publishes Science magazine and things like that, or the Science Journal. The journal Science. It's getting to be the time of the day, right? They have several fellowships that they have. They have, mass media fellowships for science communications. But the fellowship that I actually came to the federal government through is the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And so the goal of that fellowship is to make policy-savvy scientists. And so they place scientists primarily from academia, a few from industry, into government agencies, into the judicial branch, into the congressional, you have fellows on the Hill, and it really is to learn how to communicate the science in a way that is effective, whether it's for policy or general communication and things of that nature. And so it's a long-running program. I think it's probably it just made 50 years.
It's a great program.
A few years ago, and it's a phenomenal program.
And I hope they fund 1,000 fellows a year. Is that right?
Yeah, right.
How many?
1,000?
No. They select about 200 a year
Yeah.
worldwide.
They
yeah.
do. Okay.
So one other thing I wanted to add was I was talking to somebody at the NIH recently who handles training grants at the Neurological Institute, NINDS. And he said, there are things that they like to see in training grants. These are training grants to support graduate students and postdocs that are different from the norm, right? And one of the things he suggested, which I thought was a great idea, was to train students and postdocs to give short talks that communicate with the lay, non-scientific audience, like how would you explain your research to your grandmother?
Yeah.
And he said, write that into your training grant. So that would be something to think about in terms of what you could implement in a school.
One of the challenges that I have and experience is not being sure that it's quite there yet. I mean, it's sort of this hesitancy to go public while you're still need to do more to make sure that what you're looking at, you need other people, to replicate. And so I worry sometimes when things go out that are seductively presented, but really not quite right.
Well, that's not when we rewrite it. That's when the press writes it. And, you show that the phase is shifted in adolescence, and the press comes out and says, new study shows high school students can't fall asleep.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some of that, but there's some of when do you let the genie out of the bottle?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if that's a...
You'd think English professors would have an advantage in this regard, but it turns out a lot of us have trouble communicating what we're doing with bigger audiences as well.
Come on, Marx,
academic.
structuralist theory.
Yeah.
Nothing could be easier.
Well, I think we're nearing the end. We wanted to ask if any of you would like to say any last bit for the conference. We're nearing the end of our time.
Well, I think one of the takeaways that I hope people got from the conference was that, sleep is this ubiquitous behavior as well as underlying biology, right? And that is not just for the brain, it's for the entire body.
Great, thanks. No pressure here, but you're welcome to say something.
Well,
In the closing
from my
right, Mary.
perspective, I mean, the best thing about all of this is all of this.
Yeah.
And thank you for putting all this together. I mean, everyone who's here are just, so touched by the science
Yeah.
and the social needs.
It's beautiful.
You guys rock.
You rock.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
So all of you who are present should become advocates and spread the word and tell your families and your friends and even get a little bit pushy.
Right.
One thing that I want to be an advocate for is for events like this that are central to the life of a college and galvanizing and bring alumni back and bring in community members to really get their minds around important issues from a variety of perspectives, and I can't figure out why my own university doesn't do something like this to put it at the center of, and I'm so impressed, so many classes are diving into this material. The students I've talked to have just been so engaged and so informed, and this is really a special thing, so I feel, just incredibly privileged to have been part of it.
Indeed.
Thank you all. Thanks for those of you who have held on till the end, whether you're online or in person here. And just a reminder of how, yes, just as Benjamin said, how important these kinds of conversations are. So please go home and be confused and talk to each other about your confusion and Google it and write to Nobel Conference, and we'll pass on your questions to others. But really, what we are hoping you've learned here is how important it is for us to be curious with others together, because we're animals. And we need each other. We need each other to understand things. You have an opportunity to do it next year. This was fabulous, and next year is going to be as well. And that is going to be sugar, bringing sweetness to light. October 7th and 8th.
Wow.
Here we're going to look at sugar in all the ways, from the click chemistry of Carolyn Bertozzi, who won the Nobel Prize in about 2019 for her work about how giant sugars do things in our cells. It's being explored as a possible delivery system for drugs in the future. Really fascinating, cutting edge stuff, all the way down to the World Cup in pastry winner, who will come and talk about the joy of sugar. So all the waterfront of sugar, so to speak, including sugar as a part of the global slave trade and global colonialism. So it's going to be a really wide-ranging, broad-ranging topic that will be challenging for the speakers to engage with each other. And I think that is another thing about the Nobel Conference that's special, is that people are straining to understand each other and to ask each other a question. For our students, that's an amazing experience to watch that. Oh, you mean English professors don't automatically know how to talk to neuroscientists, that we actually have to learn how to do that, and that we study. So thank you all for playing along so nicely with that. And thank you all. Please drive safely home and get some sleep.
Yes.
Hey, hello everybody. Hey, that's it. This is the end of the show.
Thank you all for
Tane Danger, one last time.
Maggie Kurth.
Thank you all so much. This has been Nobel 60. This year, all sleep unraveled. Wow, what a couple of days.
This has been such a great, great conference. I learned so much science.